For our final lecture of the semester, we're talking about archaeology of today and tomorrow. So when it comes to our goals of archaeology that we talked about in the beginning of the semester, how can we accomplish these goals despite the challenges we face in the modern world? For example, issues with globalization and development, climate change, warfare, as well as cultural tourism. Well, to do this, we need methods that help us to preserve as well as record as much information as possible before this information is just gone. We just lose it forever. So let's take each of these in turn, beginning with the issue of climate change as a global threat. When it comes to archaeology specifically, in the more Arctic climes, we see there are rising sea levels and storm activity that are increasingly eroding coastal and inland sites. There used to be these sort of rings of sea ice that would protect the coastal areas, but the less we have that, the more exposure these sites are seeing. It's eroding away the landscape. You can see up here, some wooden beams that are just completely eroded out and will just dissolve in place essentially. Among the Channel Islands in California, this is where we see some of the earliest evidence of humans moving and settling into the Americas. We heard it highlighted when we talked about the peopling of the Americas early in the semester. These rising sea levels again are going to, completely destroy shell middens and other rock shelters where we see the earliest evidence of humans coming in around 13,000 BP. Retreating glaciers are yet another example, as remains that are trapped in them. Remember, we talked about Ötzi earlier in this semester. The glaciers retreat away. We're seeing these cultural materials, these fabrics and things that once exposed to the air are going to just disintegrate away. So once they become exposed, archaeologists really have to race up there to recover as much information as possible. At the site of Chan Chan in Peru, we're seeing increasing El Nino activity, which means it's wetter than it used to be. The rains that then occur are eroding the site out of existence. These are adobe brick structures, and the acidic rain is just melting them away. On the opposite end of things, we can see sites in the Sudan that were originally built in what was a grassland area, but are becoming increasingly desertified? Is that a word? Increasing desertification is definitely something you can say. So these encroaching sands are threatening to either, completely erode away the etchings and decorations on the building, or could eventually completely bury it in sand. Another example of why we need more archaeologists in the world, unfortunately, are when humans behave badly. So believe it or not, when the genocide occurred in Rwanda, there was an ethnic war of about 500,000 people that died. They were unfortunately buried in mass graves, and those graves needed to be documented and excavated very carefully, and so archaeologists were actually called in to help with that work. Archaeologists have also worked at massacre sites in Iraq, Croatia, Yugoslavia, and El Salvador. I have a friend that works on the recovery of missing in action soldiers across the Pacific, actually, dating back to World War II. Also, the sites of natural disasters. Unfortunately, archaeologists are really good at recovering remains, recovering them within context so that we can figure out who these people were. The same is true for the 9/11 attacks at the World Trade Center. Again, I have another friend who worked on the recovery of the objects that were left in the buildings and trying to retrieve these things to be returned to the victims' families. When it comes to terrorism as well, we see the terrorist groups taking hostage of sacred sites, places that are important, to try and get money out of people who are willing to help preserve these sites, but also sometimes just to destroy the history for the sake of why not be destructive. In the case of Palmyra in Syria, that was what happened, and thankfully there's a few links here to some of the destruction that did occur, just flattening of buildings. Since then, luckily, there has been reconstruction, and a lot of these sites are back to being able to be visited, although I don't know if that's really the case with the ongoing conflicts there. Contested spaces is also something important to keep in mind. Many places here in the US and elsewhere are considered sacred places to indigenous and descendant communities. There's a film that I saw actually back as an undergrad called the Sacred Land Film Project that really made an impact on me. I would recommend it, and there's a link here in the PowerPoint. The film takes us through several examples of these contested places. So Mount Shasta in Washington is one of them. The Wintu tribe sees it as a sacred place, but there were these New Age, crystal-loving peoples who came in and were bathing in the sacred waters and just disturbing the sacredness of that place for the tribe. Similarly, Devil's Tower, which was one of the earliest monuments created by Teddy Roosevelt, is a very popular rock climbing location as well, and so determining the best way for indigenous peoples to still practice their rituals within the landscape but not be disturbed by the hammering or yelling of rock climbers who enjoy the space for a different reason. So how can we negotiate that? Lastly, it does talk about the San Francisco Peaks in the film, and that's something you should definitely be aware of. The Hopi and other tribes in the area have been fighting against the Snow Bowl and their use of fake snow. To them, that's desecrating the natural landscape and is something they're hoping to eliminate. All right, when it comes to the archaeology today, the archaeology of us, we can look at a few examples. The first of which your textbook talks a bit about is the Garbage Project. Now, this was started in the 1970s by William Rathje at the U of A. This was a long-term study of modern American society using their garbage. So these researchers went out, they had people fill out questionnaires about their daily habits, how much meat they consume, how much wine they consume, yada, yada, yada. And what they eventually found by going and collecting their trash and documenting and recording how much they actually did of different activities based on their trash is that people lie, which really should not be that surprising. So the project began in Tucson. They posed as trash collectors in order to get access to the material culture. Eventually, this study spread to 60 other places. A total of 2 million items have been recorded, over 15,000 household refuge samples, which equates to 125 tons of garbage. Now, they found some pretty large discrepancies as well as interesting patterns. The first and most significant was that people tend to drink more than they're willing to admit, and I'm sure that that is true for me as well. They also noticed, because this is a long-term study, that when reports started to come out about this link of red meat and your diet being tied to higher rates of cancer and heart disease, they actually noticed that people started eating less red meat. However, they increased the amount of meat, of processed meats that they were consuming, like bacon and other deli cuts and whatnot. So overall, their intake of the bad stuff increased, but you can see that there's some sort of translation of the information that was being put out there. Now, over the last 120 years, Americans have produced on average 2 to 8 pounds of trash per year. The composition of that trash has changed, but overall the volume has been increasing, and there are more and more efforts to decrease our personalized trash, so I hope that you keep that in mind. 70% of our garbage goes into about 5,500 active landfills, and the Garbage Project was able to look at 9 of those landfills between the years 1952 and 1989. This gave them stratified deposits they could date based on the newspapers or magazines that they found, so some direct dating going on with the historical texts. What they found out was that diapers, plastic bottles, large appliances make up less than 5% of the total volume of trash in the landfills. Paper, on the other hand, is 40 to 50%, which is not the sort of pattern I was expecting, at least. There's also plenty of other things that end up in there, of course, but overall, the picture we want to take home is these areas that are dedicated to trash are not, the land is finite, so there's only so many other places that these things can go. Okay, Another example of archaeology today being relevant, so we can learn about the past and then are therefore able to use possibly ancient technologies to solve current problems. So for example, there was an increasing population problem in South America. This pushed people into more marginal agricultural lands, and Quechua farmers in Peru and Bolivia were actually able to adopt raised field technology that was discovered by archaeologists. This helped them to improve and intensify their agricultural productivity. The experiments that were then conducted on the modern examples of this technology show that the water in these canals, so you create these raised beds with water canals between them, it creates what's called a heat sink. So crops that were kept in this area were kept around 2 degrees warmer, and because of that, they didn't succumb to frost damage as often, and that actually extended their growing season. So a great benefit from archaeological knowledge. Now, when it comes to archaeology's future, I'm really happy that so many of you stuck with us this semester because you are part of that future. Public outreach education is one of our best tools for making an impact. We can do this in several ways: public lectures, giving site tours for the public, as well as the creation of local museums and signage within sites. The benefits of that, we can create site stewards. We talked about them earlier in the semester, people who are willing to protect and educate others about the site and why it needs to be preserved. This is a really great way to engage with the local community wherever you're going to be working. And hopefully it can help to curb that demand for black market goods that we've talked about as well. Archaeology is also trying to become more inclusive. Involves the incorporation of diverse perspectives, not only feminist archaeology. The SAA has a queer archaeology interest group. We're interested in learning more about the archaeology of children or the archaeology of the human experience. The inclusion of more indigenous people being trained in archaeology is also very vital. This allows them to really reclaim their people's history through archaeological research. And we see many times there are tribal historic preservation offices or CRM departments within the tribes themselves. In fact, I worked for the Gila River Indian community just south of Phoenix several years ago. And the last thing are some more innovative technologies that are helping us to preserve cultural resources for the future. I'm going to give 2 examples of this through some TED Talks in the course modules. So I really would encourage you to take a look and see what the future holds. And I hope you really enjoyed the semester.